Welcome. About a year ago, I did a video on 10 epoxy disasters. That video turned out to be so popular, I thought I'd make a follow-up. So this is a sequel, 7 more epoxy disasters. I hope you'll learn more, and let's get started just by telling you a few things first. And here is some pictures from our previous video and from previous disasters, like dust getting trapped in the coating and peeling and solvent getting trapped in the coating. But now let's move on to today's disasters. Number 1 disaster was the spiked roller that was not rolling. So you may have watched on other videos that I've done on spiked rollers on this channel. And the purpose of a spiked roller is we mainly use it for thick coatings. So for coatings that are a bit thicker and we want to prevent the occurrence of bubbles and pinholes in the coating. And here we see someone using a spiked roller. Well, one time, as we were applying the spiked roller, the roller wasn't rolling properly. In fact, it was an old roller. It had accumulated dirt and dust and old epoxy, and it wasn't rolling properly. And this usually happens because after finishing rolling the epoxy, it hadn't been cleaned properly. So the next time we tried to use it, it wasn't working. And this is a disaster because if you've already laid out the epoxy and you just want to use a spiked roller, all of a sudden you can't use it because it's not rolling properly, and that leaves all sorts of marks on the floor. So here's some advice if you are using spiked rollers in your epoxy. 1, always clean the roller after you use it. Make sure you clean it really well after you've used it so you can use it again. Number 2, when you do decide to use it, always test it is rolling before applying. So before you actually start applying the epoxy, roll it out a few times. Make sure that it's rolling properly. And 3, here's something I learned over the years. Always have a spare roller lying around because rollers can fall apart during a project. A little screw will come off or something will happen. Always have a spare roller. You never know why you might need another spike roller. So always have a spare one lying around, because if you have already mixed and laid out the epoxy, you need to roll it out. You cannot just wait for a few hours. You need to have a solution there and then. So my next disaster, the no exit plan disaster. This is a hilarious one. It tends to happen to newbies or people that haven't really thought these things out. It's funny. It hasn't happened to me recently because it's one of those things you learn over the years, but it does tend to happen to customers of mine who aren't as experienced. And the problem here is, when you go into a room and you're going to lay out the epoxy, or if it's going to be several rooms, like in this example here, you always need to have a plan where you will start applying the floor and where you will leave. Because as you leave, you need to close the doors, close the windows, close the lights, and leave. And that means you need to know exactly where you're going to be mixing your epoxy, where you're going to be where you're going to be storing your goods, and how you're going to get out. Because don't forget, once you've laid out the epoxy, you can't go back for several days. You need to leave it there. So, very important. Figure out mixing strategies in advance. And I'll just show you an example in this corridor. There's a door at the back. We thought we could get out the back. Turns out the customer said to me, look, we can't really get out the back because that door needs to lock on the inside. So, especially if you're working with customers or with someone else, make sure you discuss these things with them before you start. Tell them, okay, how many doors do you have? Which is the door we can leave from? Is there any problem if we leave from that door or this door? Always be clear so you can have an exact plan of how you're going to start applying and where you're going to finish. It sounds simple, but believe me, depending on areas, some rooms or some facilities are a bit complicated, so you really need to figure these things out in advance. So my next 2 examples, my next 2 disasters, these are the last square meter disasters. And I call these last square meter or last square foot, if you want to. The reason why I call these is because these are little disasters where we've got a small area left to coat and we get a bit sloppy. We're just in a rush to finish. We don't want to get too much of a hassle. So we kind of look for shortcuts. And these shortcuts end up being disastrous. So part 1. Here's an example of someone applying a small area, and he's got a small area left to apply. The problem is that sometimes we think, well, I've got a 15 kg pack like here. Do I really need to mix the entire 15 kilograms of epoxy if I only need to coat 2 more square meters? Of course not. I can just mix a little bit. And here is something. I have done a video on this. I've talked about this issue in many videos and in many articles. Never ever mix a little bit of A and a little bit of B just like that. I mean, without using a scale. And this is my next slide. Always use a scale, because epoxies need to be weighed exactly. You do not want to just kind of say, oh yeah, just add some A and some B, we'll mix it. Because if the epoxy is not uniform, you might get sticky epoxy, you might get epoxy that changes color, you might get epoxy that doesn't look uniform. So it's very, very important, if you're only going to mix a small quantity of remaining epoxy, that it is mixed at the exact precise volume or weight ratio you've been given. So always use a scale if you do not have small packs, and weigh exactly the amount you need, and the exact amount of A component and the exact amount of B component. And continuing from the last square meter, that was a first example where people do not mix the A and B properly. Number two is when sometimes people think, well, why don't I just add a bit more thinner or solvent into the epoxy, and that way I can get more surface out of it and I do not need to open a new pack. Another disaster. Do not just think, I'll just add a liter of thinner, mix it up, and then I'll just like spread it out. And look at me, I'm clever. I just saved a pack of epoxy and look, everything's done. Because it might look nice at the time, but when you come back, you could have problems. And possible problems I've seen when the epoxy hasn't been mixed properly is, or the epoxy has been thinned down too much, is one, the coating is not the same, it's weaker because the resin composition is different. You put much more thinner into it. Two, you will get discoloration. I've seen that when you add too much solvent and the color is different. The color changes when you add too much solvent or thinner into an epoxy. And three, you get these little pinholes. Another issue, this is because if you have too much thinner in the product, this evaporates and these little pinholes keep on coming up. So you want to be careful with these, with adding too much solvent. The best bet, as I said before, is if you have a small area left to coat, is one, let's just go back to this picture. One is you either have a scale so you weigh small amounts of the epoxy you need. That is the best way. Or two, if you don't have a small pack with you, so if you like buy all your epoxies in 15 kg packs, ask your supplier to give you like a 5 kg pack or something like that. It's always helpful to have one of those around. Let's move on to number 5, the low quality paint roller. This is different than the example I gave with the spiked roller. This is when you're actually using proper paint rollers to do a roller applied epoxy. And the problem here is not all of these paint rollers you find in paint stores are suitable for epoxies. Here's an example of a paint roller, and you look at it along the edge, it's kind of worn out. So if you try applying epoxy with that, it will leave marks. Another common problem I see with epoxy rollers is if they're bad quality, they leave like lint marks, or they leave little hairs. So you start applying the floor, and all of a sudden you have little pieces and little pieces stuck in the coating, and that's because the rollers of poor quality. So you never want to use those cheap paint rollers that are only for indoor paints. You always want to use high quality rollers. My favorite types are the ones that are specifically made for epoxies. You can use woolen rollers, mohair rollers, even polyester rollers are pretty good, but just make sure that they're suitable for solvent based coatings and they're a bit more, you don't want to go for the €2 or $2 rollers. They tend to be really bad quality and you will regret it. Also, something important, when you're applying epoxies, usually the roller is not usable afterwards. Just throw it out, and if you're going to apply a next coat, you get a new roller. So always use epoxy suitable rollers. And another important point, if you are applying really large areas with a roller, I have found that after maybe 400, 500 square meters, they need replacing. In feet, that would be about 5,000 square feet. So you apply, and then after 400, 500 meters, you see, well, they're kind of starting to like lose their texture and their uniformity, and they're just not as good anymore. Just throw them out. I mean, if you are doing large projects, I'm assuming you're making a good profit out of that job anyway, so you should be able to afford to replace your rollers. Never be skimpy on things like rollers. Come on, people. Epoxy is an expensive business. If you're into it as a professional, you should be in it to make money, and you should be able to afford to throw out rollers and get new ones. Now, number 6. This is a pet peeve of mine. I've had some issues in the past when I started out with epoxies, improper leveling. There's many causes, and I'll just give you a picture here. Here's an example of improper leveling. You've laid out a nice epoxy floor, a self-leveling floor, and then you see these little marks, and you're like, what is that? Why didn't the epoxy level out properly there? And there's many reasons why. Here I'm going to emphasize the main reason is usually there was not enough product, or the product was not spread out properly. And here's an example. This is when you use an old trowel, a trowel that's been used up. Now this trowel, when it was first bought, it was a pointy trowel. It was a pointy trowel, and the length was 5 millimeters. So you keep on using the same trowel. Eventually, the teeth kind of get worn out. And now, if you try applying this epoxy with this trowel, there's hardly any product being left. There's hardly any product being applied. And the product that is being applied is not very uniform. So that's what happens. You end up leaving less product on the floor. It's not uniformly spread, and you may end up getting these annoying marks. And believe me, you can do a beautiful self-leveling floor, and if you have 4 or 5 of these marks, or 4 or 5 weird lines that don't make sense, the customer is going to complain, and is going to be like, what is this? This floor looks perfect, and then these lines come along and ruin everything. So very, very important. Do not be cheap on trowels. Once you see that a trowel's been used enough times and the teeth are no longer large and they're just kind of they're worn out, replace the trowel. Again, epoxies are an expensive business. You should be able to afford to replace trowels after every few jobs. And here I emphasize again, remember to use tools that allow the proper spreading of the product. And finally, I'm going to leave you with number 7, the warm roof disaster. This is another interesting one that I've experienced, and I keep on forgetting about this problem. And the warm roof disaster, it's different to epoxy in hot weather, because I did talk about, in the previous disaster videos, I talked about epoxies heating up really quickly in the sun. And I've done a video on that, but this is something else. This is what I call the warm roof disaster. And what you get here is, you look at this picture, and this happened to me recently. We had these craters in some parts of the floor. And what happened here was, when you are working in the spring especially, this is common. So you go and lay out a floor in the morning. It's still chilly and cold. It's a normal spring day. But then during the day, the temperature rises. This is very common in Greece, where I'm from. Whereas in the spring, it may be like 15 degrees in the morning and the concrete is cold. And then by the afternoon, it's like 30 degrees or 35. And it gets really hot, and the roof heats up, and then the whole building heats up, and the concrete heats up. Meanwhile, you've applied an epoxy, and because the concrete is heating up and expanding, little bubbles are formed. So this is a very common problem, and this is actually a project we did recently where we had this. It was a bare roof, and we had underestimated that when it got warm, how hot the area became from a cold morning to a hot day. This is the completed floor. In the end, it was okay because it was only a small area that was affected by the heating up. The remainder of the area, we were wise enough to apply a second intermediate coat before we actually applied the final epoxy, and that way we were able to prevent this problem. We kind of sealed the floor twice before applying the final coat, and we ended up with this beautiful result. But this is a problem. Be aware when you are applying coats, especially self-leveling coats, and the temperature throughout the day heats up quickly. It's very common in the spring and early summer where you might have cold mornings and then all of a sudden the temperature just rises up really quickly. It is at least where I'm from. So be aware of this disaster, because it would have been a shame if this entire floor had been filled up with bubbles. It would have been a real shame. So if you enjoyed this presentation, please take a moment to like, share, or comment. If you haven't seen the previous disaster video, I strongly recommend you watch it now if you haven't already. And check out these awesome links. We've got a lot of good videos. Check out below. I'm going to post some other links from other videos and other articles we have, and a link to our online course. There's a lot of useful stuff for anyone that wants to sort of expand their knowledge in epoxies. Thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day, and hopefully I'll see you soon again.